The plan for today is to talk about two, at least for the first 2 hours. My plan is to talk about two different topics. One is kind of running on top of blockchains. So we're going to assume the consensus layer is all taken care of, everything's fine. This is just going to be kind of an hour to give a teaser about what are the different privacy solutions on blockchains. So this is going to be primarily based on cryptography. My apologies to those who really know it well, but I think those who don't will really gain a lot. And the next hour is going to be something basically, so this is maybe, if you would, to draw a layer model, this is somewhere above the consensus layer. And the next hour will be something below the consensus layer, which is basically networking attacks on cryptocurrencies, and I guess you can generalize them to general blockchain systems. And the idea there is, right, we've heard about all these notions of partial synchrony, where you can disrupt the system for a while. And I want to talk about what practically happens and how bad is it when we disrupt consensus protocols, and what are the details of what you have to take care of when you're there. And that'll be kind of, so today I'm kind of sandwiching consensus protocols from above and from below in these 2 hour talks. So maybe the first thing to say about privacy and blockchains is that blockchains are like the antithesis of privacy, because what they were designed is to reliably share information and make sure everybody gets it and can prove that they have it, right? In some sense, we've built this mechanism to have a consensus on a ledger. So everything we put on the ledger is naturally public, especially in open blockchains, in permissionless blockchains, where anybody can join, and now anybody can listen to the entire set of transactions that we commit to our ledger. That's a basic fact, right? So this is in fact something that we really like. This is where we get the power for blockchains. There's a ground truth. Everybody knows it, right? The data is exactly the same for everyone. We can assume that after we've taken care of all the details of the consensus. And then we can start to get the benefits of that. When people get excited about private blockchains in the enterprise world, they really are thinking about how organizations can look at the same data, know that they're looking at the exact same thing, that it's something reconciled and that won't be changed later, and so on. So all these properties hold. On the other hand, they start to realize very quickly that anything they put up there, any piece of information, becomes shared with your fellow participants, and sometimes these are competitors. These are people who would like to have a deeper understanding of your actions and movements. So what I want to do is to actually start maybe with the more primitive privacy solutions and show why they're not sufficient. So I want to start with Bitcoin transactions. So like a very schematic way of looking at a Bitcoin transaction is that it's composed of inputs and outputs, right? So what are these inputs and outputs, right? So there are many to many. So we have inputs and we have outputs. You can think of a transaction as this building block, and this is the UTXO model that Itai mentioned. There's a different thing, which is the account model, and transaction inputs are actually, in some sense, just something that spends a previous output. So this basically, I take money that was here and money that was here, and I'm funneling it and reallocating it to new outputs. So you might think of these as kind of the open accounts that are destroyed once I use them. They are only used once in their lifetime, so they are created and destroyed when a further transaction spends them. And in the system, a double spend looks like this. An attempt to drain the same account twice is automatically illegal, because when we connect a transaction here, we always think of it as spending all of the funds that are in that output, right? So this is an easy detection of double spends. If you have 2 transactions referencing the same output, that's immediately easy to tell. You don't have to think about amounts. Do we have enough amount to fund this and that, like you would in the classic account model? But the assumption here is that we always take all the money. So that also gives us, in some sense, traceability, right? But to be more concrete, what do we learn? We need to go a little bit into the details. Every output is associated with amounts of money, right? So this assigns 1 Bitcoin to some public key, 1.5 Bitcoins to a different public key, and maybe 0.4 Bitcoins to yet another public key. And we have our inputs, which are supposed to be spending like these previous outputs. So what they're doing, they're pointing to somewhere, to some other transaction, and they're giving maybe a signature or a other information needed by a Bitcoin script, in Bitcoin's case, to be able to spend that previous output. Okay, so that's the basic mechanism. I hope everybody by now knows it, and you can see that this leaks. I mean, this gives a lot of information. We can see the amounts; they're public on the blockchain. We have linkability between payments because these things, right? This is basically a pointer to a previous transaction, so obviously we can link them. And furthermore, when we see something, someone creating a transaction and signing, with this signature and this signature, we might assume that there's some connection between these two accounts that would have been different, right? So this transaction here, which is spanning these two accounts, we didn't know it before, but now we might suspect that they actually belong to the same entity or the same person. So that's the heuristic on what's leaked. And I really want to make it concrete for you. You really do use it to track people on the blockchain. So what you're seeing here is a transaction graph. I hope you see the blue lines. Can you guys see them? These are transactions that are related to ransomware. The reason I know it is because a student walked into my office and told me, I have this little problem. My mom's computer got hacked. They encrypted all of her hard drives, and now they're asking for a payment to this address with Bitcoins, and I don't know what Bitcoin is, and how do I trust them that if I pay them, will they decrypt the files and so on. So it turns out that she contracted a variant of Loki, which was a malware that was running at the time, and I explained what Bitcoin was and what Tor was. You needed to access the ransom request through Tor. It was on a hidden service. He didn't know why he should install software that a hacker basically asks him to install on his machine. I told him that you can probably install Tor, that's safe. I told him he could probably not get his files back unless he paid. And that in Loki's case, nothing is guaranteed, but he may actually get his files back because even malware needs to have a good reputation for giving you back your keys, because otherwise people don't pay up, right? So if you abduct people and every time that somebody pays the ransom, right, you kill your abductee, at some point people stop paying ransoms. In this case, you're abducting files. So he decided to pay, and I asked him, it's your decision, but if you do pay, I want you to give me the address that you paid to so I can follow the money on the blockchain. So one of these small blue dots is actually his transaction. You're not seeing all the inputs for the transaction. This is generated using a kind of visual block explorer. It's pretty nice, called oxt.me. That's TXO transaction outputs .me. It's really cute. You can literally give it a transaction hash. It'll open a node. You double click it. You see all the inputs and outputs and so on. You can really walk around the graph. And this is what I started to do. So this ransomware payment by this guy was actually for half a Bitcoin. And Loki was collecting payments of similar amounts from different people, either half a Bitcoin, 1 Bitcoin, 2 or 4. And that depended on which country you were from. So Israelis apparently will not pay too much ransom, so we only get half a Bitcoin fine. At the time, Bitcoin was $500, so it was $250 to release your files. I think, like if you're Swiss or something like that, or German, you might end up paying 4 Bitcoins. So if you looked at the requests, there was some optimization on the amount done by the people who are sending this. And now what you saw is that this money was actually pulled by a single transaction. This red dot here is a transaction that pulled all the money from a bunch of payments that suspiciously were all half a Bitcoin, 1 Bitcoin, 2 Bitcoins, or 4. And some of them weren't exactly that number. So there were little rounding errors, because when you ask somebody to pay $5 4 bitcoins and they've never used Bitcoin, they sometimes go to an exchange, they buy 4 bitcoins worth of cryptocurrency. But then when they send the money to the ransom software, they forget that they have to pay fees. So the ransom doesn't get exactly 4 bitcoins, it gets slightly less. And the files don't get released. You have to send a little bit more later. And there's really a dashboard that Loki was using to keep track of who paid ransom, to what degree. And there was actually an affiliate program. If you infected somebody's computer with Loki, you actually get a part of the payment. So there's a crime ecosystem running behind this. You could see the money drawn in here, and this was a really nice round number of exactly 50 bitcoins in this address. And you can see a change address. So this 50 bitcoins actually was pulled into here by what we think is the attacker. A change address, something because the money wasn't exactly 50 bitcoins, it was slightly more sometimes, also to pay fees. A change address went up here, and we found another point where this transaction actually drew 50 bitcoins from here and 50 from here, and you have a star that also has amounts that are exactly like Loki payments. And this actually went into an exchange. And the reason we know it went into an exchange is because this specific exchange would give each customer that it had a fixed address. And you could follow multiple payments to that exchange and also link them together. The exchange was BTCE. It was running in Russia. And apparently it was funneling a lot of money. So then we started following, even this payment has a little bit of incoming change from a previous transaction and change going out to another transaction. And when you start to follow those, you start to link more and more of these stars and more of them. And this is the activity of Loki for about 1 month. And there's around $2 to $3 million of revenue in this 1 month. Not bad. Loki was very successful at the time. It's only one strain, I think. And all of this money, with no exception, all of it went to BTCE. 100% of the payments. We can track and say, with the utmost confidence where they went. So this is a criminal who's funneling money that he ransomed off, right? And we can follow it, right? So my argument is that he wasn't even trying to use Bitcoin for anonymity. He wasn't even going through mixers. He wasn't trying to hide where the money was going, not sufficiently well. The money was actually laundered at BTCE. So he would give them Bitcoins. They would give him dollars or euros or whatever. And BTCE was an exchange that did not abide by anti-money laundering and KYC rules. So basically the operator of BTCE was later captured in Cyprus when he was on vacation there and extradited to the US. And I don't know if he stood trial or his standing trial for laundering something like $4 billion, including the stolen money from Mt. Gox, which went into the same exchange. So you can really track this, and law enforcement was actually doing this and other ransomware was also going to the same place. So concrete example of a criminal who might want to hide and did not. No, he got his files back though. Loki actually did release keys to everybody who paid. They had a really good reputation for malware. So maybe one of the earlier inventions, maybe I should say, right? So it goes without saying that every time you make one of these transfers, you can try and switch public keys. You can try to change your identity, but in a weak sense. So you get some pseudonymity. I can always generate more accounts and more public keys, but this basic linkability and revelation of amounts is enough to follow, right? I didn't talk about which accounts are used. I'm assuming each one of these transactions was actually paying into a new account, with the exception of BTCE that had to maintain the same public key that they gave people for deposits, because if I'm an exchange and I tell you to deposit something somewhere, I want you to be able to use the same address multiple times for multiple deposits, or at least I have to monitor it, because if I now give you a new address and I forget the old one, and you end up depositing more money into that one, and I lost the keys or something, then we're in trouble. So that BTCE exchange actually reused addresses, which made it easier to follow. Now, one of the earlier solutions to the anonymity problem was to try and mix money together. So this is the basic idea of a mixer. and it's utilizing Bitcoin in maybe something called a coin join transaction. So a coin join transaction is when many people get together, they decide to each have an input to a transaction and maybe an output or several inputs, several outputs, and they do it together. So Alice is actually hiding among many other strangers, and let's say they all put the same amount of money in, and we can then say that we don't really know which is Alice's output. She doesn't use the same addresses here and here, and she tries to kind of hide within this anonymity set. So this coin join transaction, sorry?
Who issues the transaction? You have many private keys on
Right.
And who, the transaction itself also has, who is issuing the transaction?
So there's a central place where they meet up and coordinate and say, the bunch of us are going to now do this thing. They create the message, they pass it around and sign it, each one of them in his own turn. So if you do this naively, obviously you already know that the other people know that Alice is participating in this transaction because they sent it to her computer to be signed. Maybe they can learn a little bit about the input and the output because some of the inputs are theirs and some of the outputs are theirs, so they can eliminate some of the options. Right, there's actually a marketplace where you can go and you can meet people who also want to mix transactions with you. And there are websites you can look for a coin join market, and you can even pay them fees to do that.
And how do you control that I don't withdraw more than I deposited?
That I will never sign a transaction that does not give me the same amount that I spent. Right? Alice needs to sign this thing eventually. She signs the transaction on her end, and if it doesn't, if there's no output that gives her back the money that she put in, she wouldn't sign it. Right? It's very simple. So this is just one message signed by all the participants. And there are ways to do this if you want to do a multi-party computation protocol where we're all signing together and so on. You can do all sorts of variants, but it gets a bit complicated. But my main point is that if you're not careful about the amounts, right? If people use different amounts, for example, there's a 7 Bitcoin input, and there's, a 7 Bitcoin output. I wonder who that is. Right? It'll be pretty easy to tell. Another thing that you need to be careful about is maybe the other people that you're meeting are all, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individuals here. 6 of them are actually NSA agents who are mixing with you. Together they can tell exactly what your input and output are. So, and you don't know it. So you can be susceptible to Sybil attacks yourself. And an active attacker that tries to de-anonymize can basically start to do all sorts of other things to break this scheme. So that was nice. And of course, if you really wanted to do a 7 Bitcoin transaction here safely, probably had to break it to 7 1 Bitcoin transactions. And you had to mix, and you probably mix many times. And we actually do see these transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. So this is again, on oxt.me, I found one of these transactions. I started expanding. Some of these transactions, you don't see all the inputs and outputs because that would, explode. But really, you get an interconnected graph of people mixing with coin joins, and they repeatedly do this. And there are other mixing services that do the same. Yeah.
Any incentive for honest players to do this, or any legitimate incentive?
So first, you can get fees from somebody else you mix with. You're also worried about your privacy as an honest individual. So if my boss just paid me my salary in Bitcoins, and some companies actually literally do that, and I want to spend it somewhere, maybe I don't want my boss to know where I spent my money, right? So it's a completely legitimate thing to have privacy. And I think most people want to have some degree of anonymity on their payments, right?
So you can't just assume it's money laundering whenever you see that?
No. And I think that very little of it is really money laundering, and a lot is just privacy nuts. Where it could be tax evasion as well. I mean, some of it could be drug trafficking. Some of it could be even worse. There are worse crimes, and some could be even maybe softer versions of criminal activity. But as you saw, malware wasn't running through these things, right? Yeah.
How the routine happen, and how does it all be organized on chain? Like
So we just meet together. We say, let's do a transaction with 7 of us. We'll all put in 1 Bitcoin and get 1 Bitcoin. We collect this thing. We all sign it. Then I go on and I find another group. And I take my output and I say, OK, let's now the 7 of us mix together. And we repeatedly do this. And I have this, like this plausible deniability. My anonymity set hopefully is larger.
So is it like a Bitcoin script where people put their money on and somehow there is some routing of the TBT?
No, it's an external protocol that does this, and eventually it produces a Bitcoin transaction that everybody signed. Okay. So maybe the next thing to do is to hide the amounts, because the amounts leak a lot of information, right? Part of what we were using for the anonymizing Loki was that we knew transactions amounts, and I could suspect it was more Loki payments by just looking at the amounts that matched what Loki was charging. So here we start to run into trouble, right? If we are somehow hiding the amounts that are coming in and out of a transaction, we need to somehow verify the validity of the transaction, that it's legal, right? It's not allowed to spend more money than it's getting in, right? So the inputs have to be equal the outputs. We also need to make sure that no output is negative, right? Why is it bad to have a negative output? Right? Underflow is true, but you could have like even if you're not in a finite field where you have underflow, right? Usually these things are in finite fields, or in finite buffers. But even if you didn't have one, like you have the infinite numbers. Let's say I had a Bitcoin here and a Bitcoin here. I could output 100, 100, and minus 202. Then I forget this. I just spend my 100 and 100, and I keep working with those. So I literally printed money if I just check the equality. Usually what happens when I do minus 202, that underflows, and that's also a large sum of money, so I'm even happier. So
checking it is the minus checking it?
So checking,
The people who produce the total.
so I'm going to tell you how to check it. The miners have to check it without seeing the amount. I'm not. You're right. The miners have to check it because they need to decide if this transaction is accepted or not. So double spending is still checked via the links. I point to a previous transaction so I can see double spends if they try to spend the same output here. But I need to check the amounts without seeing the amounts, right? So the trick here, and this is due to Greg Maxwell. I think also CoinJoin is actually due to Greg Maxwell. Greg Maxwell put it into Bitcoin. This technique is widely known and used in cryptography before that. So the idea is to take the amount and hide it. Okay, so how do I hide it? I take 2 generators in a cyclic group. So you can think, if you're not sure what that is, think of just multiplying numbers modulo p for specific very large primes. Actually, modulo q, where p is also a prime related to q somehow. But never mind. I basically do operations on some numbers that I picked in advance, G and H. They are generators of a group of large order. I take the amount of money that I'm trying to hide, I put it here in the exponent. So I just take the number and multiply G by itself A1 times. Let's say I want to hide A1 Bitcoins. And I take a random number, which is called the blinding factor. And I add that here to kind of hide the amount altogether, information theoretically. And this thing is then published to the blockchain. So this is a commitment to an amount, right? It's called a Pedersen commitment if you haven't seen one before. And it basically hides the amount inside it somehow, in some way. If I later want to show you, if I wanted to prove to you that this is the amount, right? All I have to do is reveal A1 and R1, and you can check that this works out, that the commitment actually is worth G to the A1 times H to the R1, right? And Pedersen commitments, their security relies on an assumption called the discrete log assumption. And basically, the assumption is that if I give you this number, C1, you wouldn't be able to do a discrete log on any of the parts. Even if I just gave you H to the power of R1, you couldn't extract R1 from here. You couldn't do the log operation efficiently in a group.
Why do you need H?
So let's say, why do I need H? The reason is, let's say A1 is really a Bitcoin amount. So I could brute force it. I know it's either Bitcoin, 2 Bitcoins, 3 Bitcoins, 4. So I could try to compute G to the 1, G to the power of 2, G to the power of 3, and then I would just hit the right number. So once I mix in another element here, and I take it to the exponent, now this is information theoretically secured. You have a random number that from the group, a random element from the group. Yeah.
I think you have a problem with you need a trusted generator generation, because otherwise if you know the discrete log of H with G, then you can
Right. So Peterson commitments do need G and H to be picked in a way that we don't know the discrete log of one related to the other, right? I'll show you exactly why in a second. So here, if you haven't seen Peterson commitments, here's like a hand-wavy quick proof of why they work. So commitment schemes need to have two properties. They need to be hiding. They need to hide the number that you're committing inside. And this is because we pick, right? If we pick R1 uniformly from 0 to P minus 1, then C1 is also uniform on that range. Sorry, not on that range, but a uniform element from the group which has as many elements. So this is actually why we take P to be a huge prime number. You can think of something like 2 to 256 or so. So it's a large prime number with maybe 256 bits. So that's the hiding property. And the fact that the commitment is binding, the fact that you can't open it up and show some other value, is because if you wanted to open up and say there's a value A2 that is actually in there, you'd have to solve this equation. You have to show that C1 equals some other G to the A2 times H to the R2, some other random number that you may have somehow pulled out that to make this equation work. One such number has to exist actually. But then what this means is that this equation is equal to that equation, right? The C1 here is the same C1 as here, and I can write G to the A1 minus A2 as equaling H to the R2 minus R1. If I take that to the power of 1 over R2 minus R1, I found in fact the discrete log of G with respect to H. So I broke the discrete log problem, and this is why this scheme is secure. Okay, so
information theoretically secure, you have to have that this number C1 can be generated by P combinations of A1, AI, RI. So
no. This is so I'm saying this is a uniformly random element from the group,
yes,
because I picked this uniformly at random.
yes,
And you don't know that, right? So this.
because information theoretically secure, I can check all possibilities. So I have to have.
No, so this will always open for any A2. There is another R that would always open this, right? You're right. You're correct. I didn't give the right property for information theoretic security. You're right. So C1 can be actually opened for any A2 if you knew the correct R1, and it is also uniform over the range. So these are two different things you want. You're right. So now we are assuming that all you see on the transaction is just the commitments. Now here's the trick, right? We see for a transaction that we had here. Now I only write C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, right? This is the only thing that I'm letting you see. You don't see the amounts. They're hiding the amounts inside. And I want to verify that the amounts actually sum up correctly. So we ask the sender for a little bit more information. We ask him for an X, a value X, and we want to satisfy this equation. We check that this equation is satisfied. This is what the miners check. They take the value of C1 times C2, and they make sure it equals C3 times C4 times this H to the power of X. And what does that actually do? If you remember what C1 is made of, it's G to the A1, and C2 is G to the A2. And if I move C3 right over to the other side, that's minus A3 and minus A4 here. And so, I'm sorry about the animation here. So an honest sender that did the amounts correctly in the commitments actually has an exponent of 0 here. And then he can, and he knows all these random seeds that were in the commitments. So he can give us an x that is exactly canceling these out to h to the power of 0. So he can easily satisfy this equation. An attacker that tries to mess up these exponents and they don't sum to 0 has a non-zero sum here. Now he needs to find an x, right, that satisfies this equation. That again goes back to breaking discrete log as we've seen before.
So who's the one that knows all these R1, R2, the single person that can
Right. So
transactions?
that's a great point. So you have to be careful about who sees the secrets Ri. If you think about it, the secrets from the inputs belong to the person spending the transaction. The secrets in the outputs are actually supposed to be the recipient's secrets because they later need to spend that money. So the person who's paying them is not supposed to know those secrets. So there is really an interactive protocol between the sender and the recipient where they first decide on the amount that they're going to pay. They start to exchange information, and they can actually, you can get it done. I'm not going to go into the details, but you're right that you have to be careful who sees the secrets.
All the participants of the transaction know all the amounts of the other participants.
Right. So yeah, but what you need to think of is usually it's just me and you, and I'm sending you money, and maybe one of the outputs is actually me again because I'm sending change to myself, and we hide the amounts in this way.
It's only to hide from the miners and other people.
Everybody who view the blockchain. You and I know, of course, you and I know how much money is being transferred.
Yeah, all the participants
Yeah.
are mixing it.
Yeah. So you and I know how much money is being sent, and we need you to know, right? I need you to know that how much money you're receiving, so you can, give me something in the store.
How do the fees fit in the story?
Okay, so when you actually have to correct for fees, some of the money has to be non-blinded, but you can actually say, like, non-blinded amounts can also be as g to the some power added here to kind of cancel this out. So there are all sorts of tricks. Actually, this is like the very basic scheme that Maxwell suggested for confidential transactions, and people started building things on top of that. And Monero actually combines this with ring signatures at the same time in some other much more complex cryptographic scheme. And you may have heard of something called Mimblewimble that also does this plus more stuff to compress transactions together. You could do these checks and hold like, for example, I can coalesce the transactions together and coalesce these numbers together so we can somehow reduce block size as well as we do this. So there are all these additive homomorphic tricks here that are actually doing addition in the exponent. You can start to do nice things with, but it's still not perfect. Okay, so one more thing that I kind of swept under the rug is that we need to check, if you remember, we need to check that none of the outputs is negative, right? Because we didn't have an underflow. So that requires another proof that you're not able to do in an additive homomorphic way, which is called a range proof. You need to show that each commitment is actually hiding a number within a certain range. And what people actually use for this today, Monero, for example, and others, is zero-knowledge proof schemes that are more general. We'll talk about these in a second. Monero is using bulletproofs now, or switching to bulletproofs. Yeah.
Where are stored the R1 of, let's take Monero. Where are the secrets stored? Because
on your wallet. It's basically the secret you need to spend the money is on your wallet. You can think of it as a key that you use just once for the transaction.
So usually I have to store it personally, or is it stored on the blockchain?
No. Personally, if it's on the blockchain, somebody else can take your money.
No, but like you could encrypt it with your private key.
You can do that, but that's pretty much still you storing it somewhere. Yeah. Is right. So this is a standard cryptographic assumption. People would say, right? A lot of cryptography, public key cryptography, in particular, is using these assumptions. And one thing that we do know, for example, is that if you have quantum computers tomorrow, discrete log is broken. So this is not secure under quantum computation. There may be, somebody might still find a polynomial time algorithm to break discrete log, and it's an unknown. Okay, so, but this is but we don't know anything about the security of any hash function. Nothing is provable, almost nothing is provable in cryptography, unfortunately, about the underlying primitives. So there are now, people are working on other hash functions, other commitment schemes in lattices and other sorts of constructions to get better security. But I'm not a cryptographer, so it's not my expertise. So I won't go into things this is dangerous terrain for me as well. So yeah.
So is this implemented in Bitcoin or?
This is implemented in Monero in even more complex scheme. Monero is another currency that Bitcoin itself is not doing that. Yeah, I think you can't do it with regular Bitcoin scripts. Yeah.
Is there a difference between having accounts and having unspent transactions?
So in this case, it's easier to have unspent transaction outputs because you consume everything and the equations work out easily. I think you could adapt it to an account model, but it will probably be just the same thing as having a changed transaction that goes into the same old account. With the idea is you probably don't want to reuse the secrets R1 because that might also hurt you.
Account-based systems are not private. You know the interaction between the
You also know it here. You know these are still linkable, right? So the amounts are hidden, but when I see two input, let's say I paid a guy, I bought drugs from some guy, and then I went to the grocery store and I paid him for milk, and then suddenly I see a transaction that spans both of these together. I'm going to say, oh, the guy who sold me milk is also dealing drugs, right? So you can link something. You don't see the amounts. So if you don't know them, you don't learn them. But linkability is still quite a lot. Seeing the structure, like of transactions, etc., can teach you many things. So now I want to get into zero knowledge proofs. Let's see how much time we have. So we have 20 minutes. Let's see if we can manage to get to the Zcash protocol. So I want to do, maybe we'll start by explaining what a zero knowledge proof is, but my goal in the end is to show you a protocol that does the hiding of amounts and also breaks linkability. So a good analogy, like a basic explanation of zero knowledge proofs, like a general audience one, is often done with Sudoku. So let's assume we have a prover and a verifier. Peter is our prover, and our verifier, I think her name is Valerie, I forget, or Victoria, one of the V's. She has a Sudoku problem that she wants solved, and Peter says, I know the solution, and I can prove it. Right, so you can think of a 9x9 Sudoku board, or you can think of a huge Sudoku board that Peter knows how to solve. And he's going to say, I know the solution. I can prove to you that I have the answer. Please pay me up in advance. So, right, if I show you the solution, you're going to run away. I'm worried you're going to run away with my money. I want to prove it to you without showing it to you first that I have it. Then maybe you trust me a bit more to give me the money. So what do they do, right? So maybe he does have the solution, maybe not. So here's the protocol for doing it. This is a physical protocol. So Peter places cards on the floor with the numbers 1 through 9 on them, and he does it in the form of a Sudoku board. And he flips over the cards that have the numbers that the verifier actually knows already, right? So these are the constraints of the Sudoku problem. You can see that they're in the correct place and that they are the correct numbers. And the hidden ones actually contain his secret solution to the Sudoku problem. Now, he tells her to pick a test. What do you want to test him on? Either the rows or the columns or the boxes, right? So in Sudoku, every row is supposed to have the numbers 1 through 9 exactly once, each number exactly once. Every column is supposed to have every number 1 through 9 exactly once, and every box is supposed to have the numbers 1 through 9 exactly once, right? So that's a constraint in Sudoku to have solved the problem.
Now I know what Sudoku is.
Now you know what Sudoku is. If you didn't, I was assuming knowledge of Sudoku. Maybe I shouldn't. It wasn't common knowledge that you have knowledge of Sudoku. Where's Joe? So now he asked her to test this thing for me. You can test the solution. I don't want to reveal it, but you need to choose one of these. And she rolls the dice. It's important. This is random and unknown to the prover in advance. And she says, please show me the rows. Check the rows. And here's what they do. Basically, Peter would now collect the rows together, each row, okay, into a pile. He puts them in a bag, right? Each row into a bag, and he mixes, right? He mixes the bag. Okay, so now he lets our verifier open each one of the bags and see that there are really the numbers 1 through 9 in each bag, right? So, okay, so she's now convinced, but she says, right, each one has the digits 1 through 9, and she says, okay, you were lucky this time. Maybe what you could have done, you could have put the numbers 1 through 9 in each row, 1 through 9 in any order, right? And you knew in advance, you guessed that I would pick the rows. So what they really do is they repeat again and again and again, and they basically amplifying the probability of catching our prover if he does these tricks. And if he does, right, so zero knowledge proofs have these 3 properties that are important. One is completeness, right? If Peter knows the solution, he can always pass the test. Obviously, if it's a legal solution to a Sudoku, regardless of what he chooses, rows, columns, boxes, he will pass the test. Soundness, if he tries to cheat and he doesn't know a solution, then there's at least one row or one column or one box that doesn't have the numbers 1 through 9. Otherwise, it would be a legal solution, right, by definition. And she will catch him with probability over 1/3 then, right? At least 1/3. So repeating, right, if you repeat n times, he cheats with probability of less than 1 to the 1/3 to the power of n, which you can make as small as you want. And the scheme is zero knowledge. Really, I guess, you can be easily convinced by a hand-wavy argument, right? She never learns anything about the solution except that it's a legal one. She just sees the numbers 1 through 9, which she knows is the property of a legal solution. Really, there's a simulation argument that you can do to prove that it's zero knowledge. Basically, she and Peter could be playing this game where they film this interaction, and they always succeed in doing right, in producing the bags that contain 1 through 9 without knowing a solution to the Sudoku problem that they're doing. And the way to do it is just to agree in advance about the tests that they're going to do. Right? So they could have been agreed in that let's first test the rows, then the columns, then the boxes. Then Peter could set up the cards so that Valeria would always appear on film, at least, to pass all the tests. So they never convince an outside observer. And the argument goes that if two people could replicate the entire protocol and the entire statistics of the interaction without knowing the solution, then obviously whatever you saw did not leak any information because they never had it to begin with, right? There's no leakage of information. Yeah?
Why we can't just put back all numbers in Sudoku from 1 to 9? We just put
Sorry? So,
we can put in each box just numbers from 1 to 9.
how do you put in each bag? You try to cheat. How do you cheat? What are the numbers that you would put here?
No,
What in a row?
when you put in on the box, you don't put numbers from Sudoku, you just put numbers from 1 to 9.
In a bag?
Yeah.
So she observes him taking these cards from the floor and putting them in the bag. And then he shakes the bag and he gives it to her on the spot. She opens the bag and checks the numbers. So they came from here. This is important. So in the zero knowledge protocol, you would call this a commitment phase. He puts it on the floor. She's there looking at him. And what he puts into the bag, basically he opens the commitment, right? Flipping this card over is opening a commitment. You couldn't change the value based on her decision. So first he commits, then she challenges him, either rows or columns or boxes. Then he opens the commitment in a special way, in some sense, and we check the solution without revealing exactly what's under each square. Right? So these are the 3 phases of this interaction. So this was a physical proof. There's a computational version. I probably won't have time to show it. I do have slides for it. Maybe I'll run through it quickly if we have time. But I want to show you what's the general computational version. So Sudoku is in some sense an NP statement. So what do I want to assume? I have some function f of some inputs. So this, you can think of x and w as a vector of inputs, each one of them, x and w. And let's assume f is efficiently computable, right? I can compute it efficiently. It outputs true or false. So you can think of f as a circuit where these are inputs, or a computer programming, or anything you want. It's some model of computation. And we call w the witness, or the hidden inputs, a witness, right? X is our public input. So in the Sudoku example, w would be those hidden Sudoku cells that Peter had. X, the public input, is just the known Sudoku cells. And the function f is just an efficient verifier of some fact, right? In the Sudoku argument, it's just a program that, given these inputs of what you put in every cell, tells you if it's a legal Sudoku solution or not. So that obviously for Sudoku, it's efficient to check if a solution is legal. You run over the rows, the columns, and the boxes. You just check this very simple fact. So it's a polynomial function. But it could be any general function that you want to do, and with private values, public inputs, and so on. And what we really did in the Sudoku case is our prover shows us that he knows w. He has a witness that makes f return true, right? He knows hidden Sudoku cells that make the program that checks legality of Sudoku return true without revealing the witness, right? Never giving us the witness. That's what we want from zero knowledge proofs for like an NP statement of this form. So now our version of zero knowledge that we talked about was an interactive protocol, right? Peter committed, our verifier challenged, and then he gave a response. On the blockchain, what we really use, we want a proof that we write once, we generate it ourselves, a non-interactive one, where everybody can later come and verify, right? We don't want an interactive version because we don't want to be talking to each person that's going to verify. So Peter really has this function. He has the inputs, both the public and the private, and he sends over some proof, some sequence of bits that somehow can convince any verifier that looks at it. They look at pi, the proof, they look at the function, they know what the function for verification is, and they look at the public inputs that they're allowed to see, but they don't have the witness. So they should be convinced that Peter has this witness, these hidden Sudoku cells. And to get a proof to be non-interactive, what you have to resort to is to also add a common reference string that they are looking at. And there are two ways to get these strings, and these usually translate into different zero-knowledge proof schemes. One is to use some public randomness and use something called the Fiat-Shamir heuristic. And there's another set of schemes that uses some trusted setup. So there's some other party that we all trust to generate some randomness and create these common reference strings in some specific way. And the thing that we trust this party to do is to later destroy the randomness and forget it. It's very important that they do that. If they don't forget the randomness, they can actually use it to prove things that are not correct, right? To prove that they know witnesses when they actually don't know them. So if you think of snarks, they fall into this scheme, and starks and bulletproofs fall into this scheme where you have public randomness. So now I want to show you how you build a cryptocurrency protocol out of this. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have, again, only commitments on the chain. The commitment is going to say, instead of thinking of inputs and outputs of a transaction, we're going to have a commitment that says, Alice owns one coin. We're going to commit to it on the blockchain somewhere. We're going to want to transfer to Bob. So we want to create a new one, a new commitment that says Bob owns one coin. And one of the things we want to be able to do, right, we want to prove with zero knowledge. So we want to prove to you a fact that we know something about these commitments, basically that the values inside are the same without revealing the values. So the thing that we did before with the Peterson commitments was in some sense it was exactly a zero knowledge proof. We did do a zero knowledge proof between, right? But it was a very restricted form of one. So what we want to say is that these amounts are actually owned by Alice. They are exactly the same. And we also will need to take care of double spending. So we need to make sure Alice cannot spend the amounts twice. And we'll also want to make sure that Bob's commitment cannot be linked to that one, right? That's the other property. We want to avoid linkability. So what I want to give you is this function f. A function f is basically a predicate, right, that has to evaluate to true or false. And I want to tell you what the witnesses are and what the private and public inputs are. So here's the transaction we want to create. So we want a new commitment C3 that Bob gets money, and the proof has to convince us of the following facts. Right? So somebody is supposed to give us C3 and a proof, and now we're supposed to be okay with putting this commitment into the blockchain because it's legal. So what does the proof need to convince us of? First of all, the proof says I, C3, this is the green thing is a publicly known input to the proving procedure, that equals the commitment to some amount and a public address. It's a commitment to a string of bits that are a concatenation of amount and public address. And these are hidden. Hidden inputs here are in yellow. And now there also exist two records, C1 and C2, on the blockchain that are hidden, private. This is also private inputs to the proof. And C1 is really a commitment to an amount 1 and a public address 1. And C2 is a commitment to amount 2 and public address 2. So actually switched C1 and C2 here. Never mind. And another fact that is also checked by the predicate is that amount 3 equals amount 1 plus amount 2, which is what we wanted. I think I forgot to check that they're also non-negative. I should also add another claim that they're non-negative. And also there exists a secret key 1 and a secret key 2 that match these addresses, and the prover knows them. They're provided as witnesses to the proof. So really, not only are there two commitments that have these values, also Alice, who's paying for the transaction to Bob, owns these and knows these secret keys. So this is a predicate. I'm also missing here another line about non-negativity of these. And now, if we do this, we know that the values balance out.
So I might have slipped, but Alice is giving 1 Bitcoin to Bob?
There's an amount here, whatever it is. Could be 1, could be 1.5.
Why do you need to know?
Because sometimes she doesn't have the amount in the right. So maybe she needs to merge two inputs. There's also transactions that would need to split. She wants to give Bob some money and keep some for herself. So, but this will work basically on the same way. So I didn't want to do a one-to-one. I wanted to also show how you do something a little bit like many-to-many to give a flavor. So now, how do we show? So I think you can think of how you would encode each one of these as an efficient program, right? To check something that is the commitment of something else, and to check that, right, is basically to do the math and see the commitment values, just to check an equation in some sense, and also public key and secret keys. But how do you check that there exists a record on the blockchain somewhere? The blockchain is huge. Is that efficiently computable? And I mean, you could do it in linear time in the number of records, but you want something more efficient than that. So what we use is the regular trick of Merkle trees. So what everybody who looks at the blockchain does, they take all the hidden records that they can't really read. They don't know what they are. All those commitments that are in blocks. They line them up. They build a Merkle tree out of them, right? And they get a root. So everybody sees this root. This root is common knowledge, right? Because everybody is looking at the blockchain, and they can do the same process. And now,
What is CRA?
collision-resistant hash. And now the root is a kind of a representative of this entire set. We use it here as an accumulator of the set. And we can quickly prove that some value x is in this set by giving a path to this element. So I give this as witnesses. So when I give you this number, and 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 this number, you can basically check that all the hashes work out. And you know that this value x was in here, right? This is the property of Merkle trees. But this is logarithmic in the number of records instead of linear in the number of records. And now this is how I prove something is in the blockchain. I provide this as public input to the proof. And all of the path is a private witness to the proof, basically hiding which record I'm talking about exactly. So all I know is that there is some record that had a path to it. I didn't know which one it is, because this is what the zero knowledge proof hides.
Could you verify one more time who provides this Merkle path to whom?
So the prover has the Merkle path. He knows the sender has this Merkle path in his head, right? He knows it because he sees the blockchain. He knows this is my commitment, really. That one. He knows which one is his. He knows how to open it. So he has the Merkle path. He puts it into the proof in this magical way, right?
He doesn't reveal the path, right?
He doesn't reveal it. It's a secret input to the proof. Just like the hidden values of the Sudoku were a secret to our verifier before. The prover had to know them to put the cards face down on the table, and there was a way to check them, but they were never revealed. So all that the verifier will know is that the prover knew a certain path, and he couldn't lie about it, but the path itself is never revealed. I think zero knowledge proofs are kind of magic that you wrap your head around somehow, and if you manage to do that, you can maybe hopefully follow the scheme. Yeah.
I know that the Bcache is a unifier. I never
Yeah. So this is exactly what I want to show. So the way we built it just now, yeah, there's another question before we go on to nullifiers? Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, if you know the witness, then you can deconstruct the proof. And if this isn't huge, they can just brute force it, the whole chain.
If you know if you know part of the witness, you cannot deconstruct the proof. No.
I mean, I can go over each node. If this isn't huge, if this technically could be not really clear.
Yeah, it is. Let's assume.
So I can go over each one of the possible witnesses.
Sure.
And then try to compute it and see, and then see if it works out.
No, the proof. So you use a trick. Actually, the proof adds zero knowledge in some information theoretically secure way, just like we did with the presence and commitment. So you can do something that handles the verification and doesn't reveal value. Our analogy with the Sudoku case is like when we mix the bags, right? So you couldn't reconstruct the proof because we did some tumbling there, right? So there's something that also goes on. It really changes from zero knowledge proof scheme to another. But there's a way to just add. So sometimes the zero knowledge proof is almost an afterthought. Just proving that some computation returned the correct value usually is the hard part. The zero knowledge aspect is often like very, very simple to do. At least in snarks it is. Yeah.
In this scheme, we also need to give the new root and prove this is the new root.
So yeah, so what you need to add is basically this existence is I know a path from C1 to the root and C2 to the root, and root is actually public input that everybody sees and puts into the proof.
Yes, but then you have to remove your C1 and C2, and if there is a new root.
So you don't remove C1 and C2. That's an issue, right? Because if you removed C1 and C2, we'd know which transactions are now spent. So we'd lose the linkability property. They are kept there. So now, but you guys are right. There needs to be a way to make sure that I don't reuse the same C1 and C2 for another proof, right? So the way I did it this far, you could create a proof for some amount from C1 and C2, and that proof would be okay. And you could create another proof for the same amount from C1 and C2, but going to another address, that would also work out okay. So this is double spending. I didn't stop it, right? How do I prevent double spending? And the trick is to use the nullifier that you asked about. That's where it comes in. So really, the commitments are commitments to an amount, an address, and some nullifier or serial number that is a random secret. It's hiding in here. And what I force people to do is when they generate the proof, right, here are the serial numbers that of the commitments that they're using up. They have to publish the serial number 1 and serial number 2. And the proof also checks that serial number 1 and serial number 2 are really inside the commitments. So that you're releasing the secret that was locked inside. This is made public. And now, if the serial number is made public, and you try to do another transaction like this, for the proof to work out, you have to release again the same 2 serial numbers. And somebody on the outside sees that the same serial number was used twice, and he says, whoop, that's a double spend, because you used the same serial number twice. Yeah?
Are the serial numbers stored on the blockchain, or where are they stored?
You hold them secret on your wallet.
No, I mean the revealed serial numbers.
The revealed serial numbers are placed on the blockchain for everyone to see. Yes.
So it grows and grows and grows.
It grows infinitely. Yes. Yes. So what you do with serial numbers, again, you can put them in Merkle trees again. And when I say something is not in a set, I can do also another proof using a Merkle tree. I can do it logarithmically in the number of serial numbers. So there are tricks to doing that as well. Yeah. Right. So what do we do? So how do we make sure? Right. This is a very big problem. If 2 people have the same serial numbers, one of them spends their money, the other guy can't, because that would be considered a double spend. So serial numbers, you just randomly choose a 256-bit number. And the chance that you and I will have the same serial number is negligible and probably will never happen, and we're happy with that. Okay, so we pick a random number. And you have an interest to do that because you don't want your money to be burned by somebody else.
It's like a secret key.
Yes.
If you randomly choose the same secret key, then
It can. Right. Right. So this thing that you are actually saying right now is actually an attack that was discovered in the Zero Cash protocol. Somebody could somehow reuse your secret number twice. It's called the fairy gold attack. Basically, you thought you got paid, but then he spends another payment with the same serial number, and your money is burnt. You're screwed. And there's a way to actually get around that. So what you could do is you could have a commitment to a serial number here. So he can have the commitment. What you need to prove, you release the commitment, you prove also that you know the secret behind that commitment. So there are also other ways, and it's a lot more complicated than that. So the scheme that Zcash eventually implemented to correct this was very complicated. You started signing things and hashing them. It's much more complicated than I give you it out here. You need to be careful. This address also here has some structure to it that you want to probably control. So I think we are completely out of time. This is a really, really interesting construction. I urge you to read the paper. So the Zero Cash paper kind of takes this idea of zero-knowledge proofs as a black box and then builds this scheme on top of that. I already messed it up in the slides by not checking that something is non-negative. I forgot one of these checks. It's very easy to miss something, and I urge you to have a look. I will say maybe that if you are looking for the schemes themselves for zero-knowledge proofs, you should look at, where's my slide for that? So maybe I will say that the proof used to take 40 seconds for Zero Cash. For the previous version, it took 3 gigabytes of RAM. It was intense. Now in their newer versions, it takes 6 seconds and has a requirement of 40 megabytes of memory, which is much more reasonable. So people can probably start using this. Sorry?
what were the numbers for to construct it? Verified proof or
The numbers were to construct a single proof on a quad-core machine. So running with 4 threads and or multiple threads and on 4 cores and at full stream, 40 seconds is really an intense computation for a single transaction, right? So this is not something you'll be doing on your cell phone anytime soon. But on the other hand, when you bring it down to 40 megabytes of keys and 6 seconds running time, maybe your phone can handle it, and maybe further improvements can even get it there, right? No, it's not just optimization. Actually, what they did is all of these proofs are running on a system called ZK Snark. Snarks are using an elliptic curve as in their engine, right? The group that everything is done with is an elliptic curve group, and they picked a specific elliptic curve that you can encode cryptographic primitives inside very easily. So if you think of what is the main thing that the proof is doing, is it's checking that records are in the Merkle tree. That's the hardest part of the computation. Checking that something is in the Merkle tree, you're repeatedly hashing something, and hashing is not a trivial computation. If you hash something 60 times, you are paying for it with a lot of computation. So they picked a specific elliptic curve that is really good for a specific to encode inside it another elliptic curve on which you can do Pedersen commitments and Pedersen hashes, basically. So you could say that maybe by picking this type of elliptic curve, they may have compromised some of the security of the protocol, but these are all unknowns. It wasn't that like the previous one was known to be safe and the new one isn't, but you added more properties to the elliptic curve on which you build this. So this is a risk. Yeah.
Really simple question.
Yeah.
So why do I don't follow completely, but why do the serial numbers don't give you traceability? Because you have to associate the serial numbers.
Serial number is a secret that I came up with, and it's released once, so you never know which record it came from. It's hiding under a commitment there, right? What I didn't do is you probably also need to sort the commitments more than I just did. You also need to add another random number in there to make it so I can't brute force it later. That's another thing I didn't do in the scheme, like the toy scheme that I gave you. So all these things are in the Zero Cache paper, which is really long, but pretty interesting.
And this bug or attack was already addressed in the Zero Cache paper or later?
The Fairygold attack. So they addressed it when they built the system. I think before the system was launched, somebody told them about it, and I think the original paper did not have the exact scheme. It's not a scheme where it's not a bug where somebody can steal your money, but it's a bug where somebody can burn your money. They quickly addressed it. It was very nicely done, and they did this upgrade to sapling, which also required, so Zero Cache also has a really cool story that they had to do a trusted setup ceremony. You need their trusted setup in order not to trust a certain guy to destroy randomness is a multi-party computation ceremony that they did with several people around the world, driving around in the desert, driving across Alaska. There's a really cool podcast by Radiolab that kind of, there was a reporter following them. At some point they were sure that the NSA was bugging the entire procedure. They were spending time on air-gapped machines, moving data from a computer that did some computation and send it to another person who then completed something. They did several rounds over several days. A crazy story of the level of paranoia that they tried to achieve for this security. With the second version, they had a massive improvement to the ceremony. You could use many more participants. Everybody just showed up in turn and added their own randomness to the process. We actually participated in this at Kedit, where several of our guys actually added. So there were like 80 people who added to the randomness, 80 different individuals in sapling, and then there was a second round that took 70 more participants to create this common reference string that they're now using. So there's a lot of stuff here.
But it's not common knowledge.
So what?
You don't know, not everyone knows that this was actually destroyed and
So each person can keep his own randomness. If a single person destroys the randomness, the whole process is safe. So one of our guys who did this process actually on purpose leaked his. He just said, I don't destroy my secret, here it is. Just to kind of prove the point that it doesn't break the protocol, that he participated. Or to kind of, I don't know, he wrote a blog post about it just for fun. So I want to let everybody go on a break. If you have more questions, maybe you should come up and ask me. Thank you.